Hello, everyone. I'm Dara Bunjon. I'm the food enthusiast here at J More Living. I'm a food writer, food stylist, PR maven, and a frustrated baker. Those of you joining us live, drop your questions into the comment box, and you'll see me turn my head from time to time to see if you have any inquiries for our guests. Before I forget about it, it's Howard County Restaurant Weeks and Craft Beverages. It is back this summer from July 17th to July 30th. Savor the flavors this summer with a culinary experience that is a treat for the taste buds while supporting local restaurants. Learn more at visithowardcounty.com. That's Howard County Restaurant Week, runs through July 30th. Today's guest is Cara Mae Harris, the founder of Old Line Plate blog, that focuses on the culinary history of Maryland. Her work has been featured on CBS Mornings, The Washington Post, The Baltimore Sun, with over 50,000 recipes logged in on her website. Her latest book, Festive Maryland Recipes, is available now for pre-order. It will be out in October. It focuses on the stories and recipes behind Maryland's celebrations, like Kinkling on Fat Tuesday, celebrating Passover or Easter in East Baltimore, Thanksgiving with oyster stuffing, and don't forget the sauerkraut. My mouth is gone here. Cara, hopefully you can speak better than I. Welcome to the show.
I'll try. Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, it's my pleasure. So what's on your plate today?
Let's see. I'm actually doing this on my lunch hour. So I've work, and then every day after work now, I'm just trying to use up my CSA because we have all these influx of vegetables. So every night is a new challenge with that.
Well, what brought you to this? Your career, I think, was data analysis.
Um,
I was trying to find out more about you personally.
yeah, I work in publishing. My previous title was data specialist. Now I'm IT specialist, and I actually work with books, doing book data. It's not not the most exciting, but it does kind of dovetail into what I do, especially now that I'm making books. Um,
And creating and doing Old Line Plate, which is an amazing site, everybody. Online, onlineplate.com. Check it out. I will mention it a couple of times. The new book is coming out in October, but people can pre-order on your website. Um, I'm just looking at my notes here. What was the impetus to set you off on this path of delving into the old recipes, not only the old recipes, but the people who created these recipes in Maryland? What was that start? What was that seedling?
every recipe has some type of story behind it. So my mission with my blog often is to find that story. Sometimes I choose the recipe and don't know what the story is yet. So it might be something about the ingredient or the history of the recipe itself. In many cases, it's about the person who contributed that recipe to a community cookbook. So I'll do my best to kind of find out about their genealogy and their history. And surprisingly, a lot of people who shared these recipes have these stories that you can actually find through newspapers and things like that. A lot of people who contributed recipes were very involved in their community, so I kind of pull out those stories. But some of them are just more general, the history of a dish in Maryland and how it became associated with the state.
All right. Um, did this book that we're talking about is your second book? Was your first book the Online Plate Stories and Recipes from Maryland? And that
Um,
was
yeah, I call this my second first book because the previous book was a collection of a lot of pre-existing blog posts that I put into a book layout. I thought it would be kind of a souvenir for a few interested people, but it's actually done really well and helped connect me with new people. Meanwhile, I've been working on some new content. So the new book, Festive Maryland Recipes, actually has stories that haven't been published on my blog, things that I did a lot of new research for. And I worked with a designer and an illustrator and a recipe developer to make it more of a complete book that people could cook along with, and something that's just visually, it's a visually beautiful book.
The graphics are really quite lovely. I just have some PDFs that you sent me because the book isn't physically out yet, but I like the layout and I enjoyed reading particular about, let's see, the Maryland rye and sauerkraut, blintzes, chocolate macaroons, and all these are involved in holiday celebrations throughout the state. And I want to tackle Thanksgiving because I personally used to say I could tell where somebody was from by their stuffing. And what you brought out on sauerkraut is it's really very central just to Maryland area. Why is that?
So the interesting thing about the sauerkraut is that in Maryland, it kind of became, especially in Baltimore, it became something that everybody does. It's not just confined to people who have German or Eastern European ancestry. So I thought that was really fascinating, and nobody knows quite why that happened. Anya Thomas from the Heirloom Food Group pointed out to me that when at the end of the Civil War, Germans were the biggest group of immigrants in Baltimore. So there's a lot of cross-cultural things going on. And if you think about food balance, sauerkraut absolutely makes sense with a rich turkey and all of the heavy things that you eat at Thanksgiving. So once people try it, they tend to really keep it around. Um, but that was one of the things that I really enjoyed about this book, because I knew about the tradition, but I didn't know that it really dated back to the 1800s. A lot of times traditions are newer than you would think. And it's really been going on a long time, that's just essential on Baltimore tables. And people have talked about it and known that it was this unique to Baltimore tradition.
Right, I agree with you. I used to the sauerkraut, and some people look at me, but I also know that there were times on our table Thanksgiving, if it wasn't sauerkraut, it was pickled green tomatoes. It
Yeah,
was still that acid, that brightness, because everything gravy, potatoes, stuffing, that just so heavy. So sauerkraut, I can't have turkey without sauerkraut. Right.
yeah, it
And
makes complete sense. The cranberry sauce doesn't really do the job. You need something more savory. But
right, absolutely. Um, I'm just moving things along here because I have notes spread out all over the table.
sounds like my desk.
The coming back here, let's see. I covered that. Now, I'm not sure if this, I think you probably have more, but I read that you have 50,000 recipes logged in on your website.
So those are actually in my database, which is what runs behind the website. I think I'm not sure how many I've actually made that are on the website, hundreds, but the database, I go and I take a community cookbook that's scanned or a manuscript, and I enter all the names of the recipes and the people that are associated with it and the different things, so that I can kind of run reports. So I can do a search and find out how many blackberry
Okay.
recipes
Yeah,
are in all these books. It makes it easier to find them and to connect the different stories, and even people who have contributed recipes to multiple community cookbooks. That's always fun to find. Some of these recipe writers were really prolific, so I can take my database and find multiple different recipes that somebody cherished over the course of their lifetime.
right. You had talked about um, the Sun Papers running cooking contest, and this was gazillion years ago, and you can come up with the date. At
1911.
1911, to bring in women readership into the Sun. And there were, for 52 weeks, every week they would publish one of the recipes. And also, if your recipe was published, you got $5. Am I leaving it to my brain power right here. But I think in discovering something in there that you found that that woman had contributed on other books.
Oh yeah, one of the I made a map because what's interesting about that contest is newspapers used to not care about privacy at all, so they would print people's full address alongside the recipes. So I made a map just to see where the different people lived at the time that contest happened. And I chose a recipe at random to make. And by coincidence, it turned out that I had already made a recipe from that person. I didn't remember that until I started researching her name and my own website came up. Her name was Harriet Blogg, and I guess she went to Goucher. So she had a recipe in the Goucher cookbook, but also contributed to this contest. And, it makes sense that people who were really interested in food would be entering the Sun contest.
Right. It was crab meat and bacon.
Yes. Yeah, crabs and bacon. She won or $5 and claim to fame.
You stated, and I've seen older cookbooks. We talked about that. I sold off my cookbook collection. The older recipes were often vague. They weren't as detailed. And a lot of what you've done is worked with it so people could understand it, but you're the one testing it out, making it, and putting up the recipe.
I actually don't do that so much, and that's why I enlisted Rachel Rappaport. She's a local recipe developer who has a lot more skill and experience in recipe testing than I do, because I've made so many of the vague recipes that I'm so used to them by now that I barely even notice what's missing. It says to cook in a slow oven, and I know that's 325 degrees. So I couldn't really trust myself. I do try when I put them on my website to make them a little bit more clear and fill in information. And sometimes people ask me for more information, but I absolutely had to call in for backup when it came to updating some of the old recipes to make sure that people who get the new book can actually make these dishes and won't waste food or have a failure on their hands.
And I don't think people realize that in your going back, that Maryland was really a hub for many, many recipes. Fudge, obviously crab cakes. What other recipes do you
The
think
fried
people?
chicken here was huge. That Maryland fried chicken, which was served with cream gravy, often on waffles, so people would come here by train or boat even, and stay in the fancy hotels in Baltimore and expect to eat these foods. Of course, there was the oysters, which often came from the Bay, sometimes even from Virginia. They were brought here, but it was still a big source of Maryland pride. And a lot of other recipes, even when you think of something that you don't think of as Maryland, like plum pudding that's in the book, you would see recipes where people would call it a Maryland plum pudding because the name had so much prestige that if you had your choice of plum pudding recipes, that's the one that you would want to make. People really associated Maryland with good eating.
Terrific. Pies were big. I think one of the earlier recipes was the big white potato pie.
Yeah, white potato pie is a really interesting one because when you look at sweet potato pie and pumpkin pie, they all come from pudding, basically, back when everything used to be a pudding from our English ancestry. So the white potatoes was just another thing that people would take and sweeten it up a little bit, flavor it with vanilla, nutmeg, or lemon, and put it in a pie. It kind of died out in other places, but for whatever reason, in Maryland, it stayed on. There was one church in particular in Davidsonville that always served it at Thanksgiving, and they shared their recipe in the Maryland's Way cookbook. So some people have kept this white potato pie alive in Maryland, and a lot of people ask me about it because it sounds kind of quirky, but if you think about rice pudding or other kind of starchy things,
Right?
it's really in a similar vein.
You brought up vanilla. There was something, I don't know, I've been delving into you since 6 o'clock this morning. I don't know if you felt it, but I was
No, I'm
trying
not.
to go deep and learn things. You talked about, oh, it was the CBS morning,
Yeah.
Sunday morning. And you talked about rose, that before vanilla there was rose extract or rose
Rose
and
water. Yeah.
rose water. And once vanilla came in, rose sort of went to the wayside, which I'm
Yeah.
happy about.
Yeah, I've made a few things and I don't mind it on occasion, but I can't imagine if we were really still using the main flavors were rose flower water or orange flower water or nutmeg. And it's hard for us to even imagine using those to the extent that people used to put them in absolutely everything. We kind of take vanilla for granted, but it's very special that we can enjoy it to the extent that we do. I'm a fan of vanilla
Absolutely.
as well.
Yeah, I'm vanilla. Absolutely. But the Middle Eastern come in Persian with the rose water. And it's fine, but you have to be really, really careful because you can overdo it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Certain dishes, a number of years ago, the International Association of Culinary Professionals had their conference in Baltimore, and I was on the committee for the opening event, and it was at the aquarium. And I said, I would like to show off some foods that were traditionally Maryland. One, cotties. Two, a chocolate snowball with marshmallow topping. And I say that because you thought that that wouldn't be the number one flavor, but your investigation found out that it was. Um, I think I had crab claws. What else did I do? Corned beef. So, what did you think in the snowballs? Give us a little history because I know you wrote snowballs. Some little bit background on how snowballs came to be or what they're doing.
Yeah, the story about snowballs that I've heard the most is that ice wagons would come through town and kids would kind of follow them and they'd shave off a little bit of ice for these kids in the summer, and mothers or people in the neighborhood would make flavorings. But it became an industry onto itself. And Baltimore had a very strong street vendor culture. We had a lot of food that people were, selling out on the corners. That includes crab cakes, deviled crabs, oysters, which is kind of weird to think about in the summer, people peddling oysters around. But snowballs were part of that, and it became a profession, and people started manufacturing syrups. And when I made that, I actually found it's hard to find recipes for syrup because it was something you would buy, really. But there was a news article where they had some recipes for the chocolate and strawberry and some other flavors of syrup. So I made those. But
How did
chocolate's
they?
my favorite, yeah.
Okay, they turned out okay.
Yeah, I don't think that they're quite the same. I don't know if they're historically accurate per se. People might have been using artificial flavorings even, but they worked out. They were just thicker than what we get now with the cold kiss syrups that we use.
Okay. On average, okay, you decide here's a recipe for Chesapeake Restaurant's Imperial Crab. How long does it take you on average when you get involved with a recipe? How many hours can this take you to develop it, test it, research it, map it?
Yeah, that depends. That depends wildly. Some of them are just quick. I'll make the recipe in an afternoon and then spend a couple of hours researching the person who did the recipe. But then there's a few that I like to give special attention to. I have one that I haven't posted yet. I made these chicken croquettes recently that were associated with a caterer. And historically, when you talk about, we didn't have famous chefs, we had caterers. So the celebrity chefs of the early 1900s were known as caterers. Um, and I made this recipe, and I just think there's a lot of background that I need to find, a lot of other references. I want to make sure that I write about this history in a way that's really informative. So I might go to the Pratt Library and pull out some books and things. So it really depends, but I put a lot of time into them.
In the work that you've done, I think you wrote, or it became pretty apparent how slavery played a part in what we're eating today. What was the book? Uh, 300 Years of Black Cooking from
And
St. Mary's County.
yeah, I love that book. It's such a unique Maryland treasure, and it was put together in the 1970s by a lot of people who were descended from people who were enslaved on the Jesuit plantations in that area. And they have the unique tradition of stuffed ham there, which you can get all over St. Mary's County and can trace it back to these plantations. But in the city of Baltimore, when people came to these fancy hotels, they really did want a kind of Southern experience. You know, it was very much associated with being the gateway to the South, and people expected to be waited on by Black waiters and have Black chefs. And it was a kind of culture that had been built upon the history of slavery for sure, especially the seafood, the crab cakes, or especially the deviled crab, which was much more popular than crab cakes. And
Really?
yeah, up until around the 50s, deviled crab was king and crab cakes were kind of just an afterthought. So interestingly, they won out.
What's the difference between a deviled crab cake and a crab cake?
Deviled crab can have a lot more variation in the recipe, but it's generally served in the shell and usually broiled. So it's almost like a crab salad, or sometimes essentially the same ingredients as a crab cake, just served in the shell, topped with breadcrumbs. So it was something that was considered very elegant. And they were all the rage, to the extent that people would even write articles in newspapers about how like annoying this trend was of everybody eating deviled crab and how they were overpriced and things like that. But that was the big
A big
Baltimore.
thing. And, I love when I travel and I go and I'm in the Midwest and they go crab cake. I go, ain't touching it. Just ain't touching it. We're pretty spoiled here with crab cakes. In your celebration, I want to get back to your book that's coming out in October, and people can pre-order at oldlineplate.com and check out everything that Kara has written. Um, you talked about the holidays, and you talked about the holidays in East Baltimore being for the Jewish families for Easter. What what recipes stood out in your mind from that time?
Um, from East Baltimore. Well, the recipe called macaroons. They used to call essentially meringues macaroons, but that was a recipe I was very happy to get in there because it came from a cookbook that was put out in 1908 um, by a group of Jewish women raising money for the Hebrew Day Nursery. So it's a really old cookbook, and I was excited to have that adapted by Rachel into the book. And that would be something that you could make for Passover. But I did research on different people. There was another one from a woman who lived her early life in East Baltimore and then later moved up by, why am I blanking on the neighborhood name?
Reisterstown Road,
Yes, yeah. So she later,
Pikesville.
yeah. Um, so, I traced her story and made her blintzes. I actually gained, there's 3 Jewish recipes in the book, and I have quite a few cookbooks, but I gained such an appreciation of the kind of prescriptive food traditions for these different holidays, because there's so many to choose from, and it's had such an influence on Maryland food. So it was really interesting to read these different stories, and I read about Montgomery County and the way that the Jewish culture developed there from just a few people who had to go to great lengths to get kosher foods into now a sizable percentage of the population.
Right. The I have so many questions. I'm so wrapped up in everything that you've done, I'm just looking at my notes. We talked about the blintzes. The apple toddy. Let's take a moment to talk about that.
That's a really interesting drink because it's very old, probably dates back to colonial times, and you roast apples and then soak them in very strong liquors like the Maryland rye, some brandy, and a different combination of liquors. And it's often served cold on ice, maybe even up to a year later. They said that you should have cobwebs on your demijohn if your apple toddy is high quality, but you can also make it. I've made it and aged it a year. I've made a different version that I aged for maybe a week. But
You
it's a
did
very
age it for the year?
Yeah, I did age a batch for a year a few years ago. That took a lot of patience. It was just in my basement, and then I brought it to a party. I don't know that I have that many reasons to use that quantity of liquor. It was this big jar, so I had to find a party to bring it to.
I
But it's
hope.
an interesting drink that I always expect to see it make more of a comeback because there's more distilling happening in Maryland again.
Right.
So it's really appropriate for those kinds of strong hard liquors that people are doing. And it's a little, less. A lot of people have an aversion to the dairy and things that are in eggnog, so it has less of that, but it does have quite a kick. So it's a trade-off.
Yeah. Well, I'm just trying to see. You're going to be doing a class for the Pratt Test Kitchen in October.
Yeah, it's not a class. It's just going to be a talk. I'll probably tell some stories. There were a few things that didn't make it into the book. We swapped out different things to try to make a balanced menu. And that will be the release of the book so that people can purchase it, or maybe if you will pick up copies that they already purchased. And that will just be kind of like the celebration of the book and the sharing of some of those stories. I'm really looking forward to that.
Well, it should be fabulous. And I think they're going to have an online to it as well. So if people
Yes.
can't make it down to the Pratt, it's going to be online. And John Shields, Mr. Crab Cake, did the foreword to the story. And it's interesting because it's his restaurant, Gertrude's, that runs the Kraut Fest.
Yeah. Yeah. So he was a perfect choice for that. And I was just so, I couldn't believe he said yes, but that was, yeah, that's really great. And we've kind of kept in touch because he's always doing such great things for local food and for the environment, the issue.
He was at the forefront.
Yeah.
He really was. And farmers market, and that he sticks by. So let me come down to some questions I ask at the end of the show. You've been forewarned, so you're prepped. What was the best bite you had all week?
I got some Polish sausage. The Polish deli in Baltimore closed, much to my sadness. So I ordered some Polish sausages and made some beans with those and some kale, and it turned out really good, and just a nice velvety pot of beans.
I'm trying to think. Tom Pons, Chef Tom Pons, took over in the Fells Point market, the Polish market there. You might be able to reach out to him to see if you can find it.
Yeah, there is some stuff available in there. There was just another place that I used to go, Krakus, where they just had a little more space to have a lot of Polish ingredients.
Right.
But it's true, there is still a place in Broadway. I should go there.
If you could go back in time and give yourself a piece of advice, your 18-year-old self, what would it be?
Well, my database is something I created, and I taught myself a lot of IT skills. And I did one semester at UMBC, and I always walked by the IT department and kind of ignored it. So I think I would tell my young self to turn in there and take some classes, and that I actually had an aptitude for that. But on the other hand, right now I feel like I'm right where I'm supposed to be, so I can't complain too much.
Okay. If you wake up tomorrow morning with a new talent, what would the new talent be? And it can't be data, can't be IT.
No, luckily I've taught myself that to a pretty good extent, but just patience. Right now, we sent the book to the printer. I have one copy. I have the proof copy here, but we sent it to the printer and told them to print. Now I have to wait, and I'm just going crazy waiting to get these books back and just get everything rolling and get them in the hands of people. So I'm a very impatient person. I would love to wake up with just a little bit of
Some
calm.
patience.
Yeah.
Yeah. God, I want patience, but I want it right now.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Okay. And your ultimate culinary fail.
I have a lot of them because of making these old vague recipes that we've talked about. One real good one is that when baking powder first came out, they called it yeast powder. So I once made waffles and put yeast in them. So of course they didn't rise. They didn't have any time for the yeast to activate. I was so confused by this recipe. That was pretty early on, and later I found out that they actually meant baking powder should have been in the waffles. So those were pretty uh, less than pleasant. But I also made a weird recipe for a kind of cheese that was made with potatoes, and it was a weird recipe that I found in an old newspaper, and I didn't really expect it to turn out, but it really didn't turn out. It wasn't even salvageable into a stew. Usually I try to rework my failure. This was in the trash, sadly.
Right. Well, I want to thank you, Cara May Harris,
Thank
oldlineplate.com, Festive Meals. Check out her website, her Instagram, old-plate.
Yeah, I think it's old_line_plate, maybe.
No, it's old
Oh, is it?
hyphen,
Oh,
yeah, old hyphen line hyphen plate. You'll find it.
yeah,
There's
it's
a
on my
link
website.
on her website. You'll find everything that you need to know. I want to thank you so much. So glad that our paths crossed
Yeah.
and I got to meet you. And you just fascinate me with everything that you're doing. And please keep it up because we need it.
Well, please keep, hosting people and bringing these stories to people. I love what you do. So I was,
Well, it's a mutual admiration society. I want to thank you, Kara. Have a good rest of the week, your lunch hour. Thank you for taking it. And we'll cross paths again. Everyone, Kara May Harris. Thank you.
thank you. Take care.
All right. All right, everybody. I want you to support local restaurants and build community with the Howard County Restaurant Weeks and Craft Beverages that is running through July 30th. Indulge in delectable meals while showing appreciation for the county's diverse options. Learn more at visit howardcounty.com. I cannot talk fast and do it well at all. My food tidbit of the week, I think I'm just going to make this a common thing to do during the show. In Baltimore, Need's Bakery in Harbor East, which has been open for breakfast and lunch recently, is expanding their hours to include dinner from Wednesday through Saturday. Selections range from tempura of summer veggies to jerk octopus, five-spice duck to burrata and melon. A friend of mine, Chef Cyrus Kiefer, is there, so a shout out to him, and that is Need's Bakery in Harbor East. Also, monthly, Jaymore is giving away $50 gift cards to some of your favorite local restaurants. Visit jaymoreliving.com/contest to enter to win. Co-owners, husband and wife, Chef Dwight Campbell and Nicole Foster, who left the corporate world to change the ice cream game with Caju Creamery, plant-based ice cream company here in Baltimore that's committed to crafting super premium ice cream using whole superfoods free of chemicals and artificial flavors or fillers. They will be our guest next week, and that is Caju Creamery. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. If you need to reach me, you can reach me at food@jaymoreliving.com or on Instagram at Dara Cooks. All shows are immediately archived in video form on Jaymore Living's Facebook page and jaymoreliving.com. Feel free to dig into our video archives of past shows. We truly appreciate it when you share our show with friends and family. It helps it grow. May your plates always, always remain full. I will see you next Thursday, and thank you for joining.